Welcome, everybody, to Conversations That Matter. My name is Alex Newman. I'm your host here, Senior Editor at the New American Magazine. Folks, the Federal Reserve is in the news a lot. Donald Trump is trying to get them to lower interest rates. Jerome Powell has been in the news for his building projects and other reasons recently. And there's a lot of interest in Congress now in doing something about it. One of the individuals who's involved in this process is Congressman Warren Davidson. He represents the 8th District in the state of Ohio, and he's got a number of bills that he's working on this front to either rein in the powers of the Federal Reserve, audit the Federal Reserve, or even reform in some very important respects this institution. And a lot of other bills he's working on as well to end the liability protections for vaccine manufacturers, some of the PrEP Act protections for some of these manufacturers. And he's also got an incredibly interesting bill to have the government research Trump Derangement Syndrome. So Congressman Warren Davidson joins us today to discuss all this and more. Congressman, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me. I look forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. Really appreciate you joining. So you've got 4 bills right now, at least, that you are either sponsoring or co-sponsoring dealing with the Federal Reserve. You've got the one, this is a big one, Prohibition on IOER Act of 2025. That's H.R. 146. As I understand it, it would basically prohibit the Federal Reserve from paying interest to these banks when they're keeping excess reserves at the Federal Reserve. Talk to us about this. Why do you think it's important?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 variations on this. Prior to 07, the Federal Reserve wasn't allowed to pay banks direct interest. So banks, of course, had required reserves since we've had banks. But let's say a bank was, by size, required to hold $1 billion worth of reserves. They had to manage their own balance sheet. They would go into the market and buy treasuries. They would put it in other investments, but they had to have immediately liquid reserves, short-term treasuries, to cover the required reserves or cash. Now they just leave it in deposit with the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve manages that. And initially, they only managed it for required reserves, but now they've increased it all the way up to any amount of money that that a bank wants to leave at the Federal Reserve, they get interest on. And when interest was really low, 50 basis points, 0.5%, there wasn't a ton of excess reserves being left at the Fed. But now, Federal Reserve's paying like 4.4% on these master accounts, and so you have banks that are making more money than hedge funds make for management fees. So they don't have to do any underwriting or anything else. And that's why it's so important, because banks essentially are incentivized not to deploy capital into the market. And so you've seen this massive rise of non-bank lenders because banks aren't really doing the work of banks.
Wow. And you've got another bill that you've co-sponsored. We've talked about it on this program before, then we've interviewed some of the other members who have supported it. The bill to audit the Federal Reserve. Why do you think it needs to be audited? I mean, it may sound like a dumb question, but I mean, we can't trust the Fed to police itself?
We definitely can't trust the Fed to police itself. And look, if all men were angels, we wouldn't need government, frankly, right? But we do. And just because they're part of the government doesn't mean that they're somehow angelic, as we've seen through any number of instances in history. The Federal Reserve should have clear accountability. If we're going to have a central bank, it should be accountable to somebody. But they want to be completely autonomous and essentially exist in this sort of world where they're sort of federal but sort of private, and they're accountable but they're not. And that's where the audit is so essential. You find out exactly what they've been doing with their money. I mean, prior to 08, the Federal Reserve's total assets were under $1 trillion, about $800 billion. But if you look at managing the COVID crisis and everything else, during that run-up between the 08 financial crisis and now, the balance sheet grew to over $9 trillion. And still over $8 trillion. What exactly do they hold? How do they hold it? What kinds of things are they doing with it? When you look at their, Secretary Bessent, Secretary of Treasury, recently said that they've essentially become universal basic income for PhD economists, and that's because they employ a massive number of them, and they still don't get things right.
Wow, that is a funny way of putting it, and I've heard that myself. Amazing. Well, Congressman Ron Paul, who was one of the big supporters of the audit the Fed bill back when he was in Congress, I think he left a little over a decade ago, he always said that if and when the American people figured out what the Federal Reserve was doing with their money, there would be such national outrage that there'd even be a push to end the Fed. Do you think it's that bad?
Yeah, I mean, it might be the point where this Fed we might need to get rid of and just start over again with a different form of central bank. At one point when I was talking with Jerome Powell, he was still saying that all this massive spending while closing the economy wasn't going to cause inflation. And then he later said, well, it'll be transitory, right? Well, I was talking with him privately, and he said, well, what are we going to do, not cover for you? And I'm like, yes, that would be exactly the role of an independent bank. An independent central bank would say, yeah, we're going to set rates based on a market metric. We're going to have sound money, and we're not going to automatically cover for unlimited deficits. And certainly you wouldn't expect an independent central bank to call for more fiscal spending in light of the fact that you're already doing so much it's going to cause massive inflation. So they've missed the mark so badly, and then they want no accountability. So they may not be fixable in the first place, but the audit should occur. And the other thing is, another bill I've got is to basically end their regulatory approach. The central bank's supposed to deal with monetary policy, but they've also claimed for themselves all this responsibility for being bank regulators. And they impose all sorts of things with very little accountability. So even when Congress wants to shape the role of bank regulation, the Fed kind of sees themselves as this autonomous agency. They don't steer at all, and they're not on appropriations. They just make money from operating the central bank.
Yeah. And I've noticed every time a Republican says anything about the Federal Reserve, it's, oh, you're trying to politicize the Federal Reserve. And yet just a few years ago, the Democrats ordered the Federal Reserve to focus on racial and ethnic disparities and to invest in equity. I know you were very critical of that at the time. You blasted it as politicization of the Federal Reserve. What do you think about the Federal Reserve kind of entering into all these cultural, political, racial discussions?
Yeah, I mean that's the drift, and that's basically using their coercive power as bank regulators. If you completely take away that power, there's nothing for them to politicize. And then you could still say, well, as central banks, they could do whatever. Look, their job is essentially to preserve sound money. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. All they have to do is not mess it up. And the key to that is stable prices and the use of the dollar as an efficient means of exchange. So they should be, jealously guarding the power of the dollar. And instead, they're engaged in all kinds of other activities. And perhaps one of the most politicized parts of the Federal Reserve System was the San Francisco Fed. And, of course, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, where they were supposed to be getting oversight from the San Francisco Fed. So as a bank regulator, they continually fail, and still there's no accountability for the Fed.
Yeah. You mentioned something really important. A couple of years ago, I spoke with Congressman Alex Newman. He had a bill to restore the gold standard. And one of the big concerns he expressed was that the Federal Reserve was recklessly endangering the dollar's status as a global reserve. He warned that hostile actors, especially the Communist Chinese Party, were looking at this as maybe an opportunity to come in and undermine the dollar. And, of course, the Fed wasn't helping. Do you have concerns about the long-term viability of the U.S. dollar if the spending doesn't come under control and the Federal Reserve doesn't stop?
Yeah, I formed the Sound Money Caucus back in July of 2020 because to me it was obvious if you close the planet's economy and then your response is just to print money, you're going to cause inflation. You're debasing the currency, devaluing it. And so, people look with, the first thing that happens with inflation is you inflate the money supply. And that happened, very swiftly. And then it flows through to asset prices. And so a lot of people with assets, if they own their own home or they have stocks and retirement savings, they feel like inflation isn't so bad initially because the assets are getting inflated too, and it's not really that your house is worth more, it's your money's worth less. And we've seen that eventually show up on consumer prices, and that's the part where Powell said, well, it's going to be transitory. Well, in the sense that life is but a vapor, isn't everything transitory? But the reality is this is pretty enduring, and you don't generally see deflation where prices go back down to the previous price level. And so people without assets, they don't have a way to adapt. If you think about housing, in 2008, we called it a housing bubble when the median home was 3.8 times the median income, because usually financial advisors say don't spend more than 3 times your annual income on a house. Well, right now, the national average is roughly 6 times, like 5.8 times the median income. So it is a crisis. Without two incomes, the average person can't afford a home, and this is a crisis. So, that's a function of devaluing the money, and we've seen it up in gas and groceries and everything else. Inflation is maybe the most dishonest tax, and that's what's happened when you're destroying the money.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad there are people on Capitol Hill who are thinking about these things, because a lot of us little people out here, we feel the pain, but it doesn't always seem like Washington is paying attention. Shifting gears a little bit, Congressman, you co-sponsored a bill to make American elections great again by requiring the census to only count citizens. Trump obviously is moving on this front, just made a big announcement just a few days ago. We had Tom Homan on this program last year, and he actually argued that one of the main reasons the Democrats had the borders wide open is because they wanted to increase their representation in Congress by having sanctuary states in California and New York. Why is this so important, this issue of counting only citizens? And how do you address the objections from the Democrats that this dehumanizes non-citizens by not counting them?
Well, look, I'm a member of Congress. I only represent U.S. citizens. If you're not a citizen, you're represented at an embassy or a consulate, not at the United States Capitol. I mean, if we took a job in, the United Kingdom or France or something, we wouldn't feel like we had representation there. We would go to the American embassy. And we're the only country foolish enough to view that, since you're here, you go see your member of Congress. And we're going to draw the maps based on that. I mean, that's insane. And that's exactly what we're doing. And not just people that are here illegally, even legally, you're counting every person that's here at some level, even tourists are counting. We also do that with birthright citizenship. So I've tried to counter all these since I've been in Congress. I even introduced a constitutional amendment early on to try to shape the census so that in 2020 we would get an honest census. You can't really have an honest census, an honest election if you don't have an honest census, because the way the congressional maps are drawn are based on these census counts. And if you don't differentiate who's a citizen and who isn't, you give extra representation to places that have lots of non-citizens. So California, people think they have 6 or 7 extra seats because of that. And it's not just anywhere, it's skewed towards sanctuary cities. So they're overstating their population. They're getting more representation in Congress because of it. And okay, fair enough, Texas is getting extra seats too. But states like Ohio that, we have some illegal population, some non-citizen population, but as a percentage, a much smaller portion than some of our border states. So you're really denying representation to American citizens, and frankly, not even adequately representing foreigners because, again, they're supposed to be represented by their embassies.
Yeah. Shifting gears again, you've got a couple of bills that I think are really important, and it's an issue that's on a lot of people's minds right now after COVID. We've got H.R. 4668, the End the Vaccine Carve-Out Act that would end liability protections for vaccine makers. You've also got the PrEP Repeal Act that would repeal parts of the PrEP Act that give immunity to a lot of the producers of these countermeasures during declared public health emergencies. Why do you think it's important for Congress to go in and remove these protections? And maybe speak a little bit to why they exist in the first place, because I think a lot of people look at that like, well, why do they all get immunity while every other American industry actually has to stand behind its goods and services?
Yeah, this is a crazy loophole that I didn't realize existed for vaccine makers. And when they first put it out, the idea of warp speed, getting a vaccine done fast, made sense in the midst of a pandemic. But with the benefit of hindsight, you can say, look, you can't shortcut some of these things. And in particular, one of the most abusive things was, it's one thing to develop a product at a faster pace, but the idea that product was mandated for people and coercively really forced on people, is abhorrent. So I was strongly opposed to that. Nevertheless, it happened in a lot of ways. And people might say, well, the government didn't really ever pass a law. Some people try to deny that it was the case. Look, in Ohio, our governor, a Republican governor, was using, the power of restaurant regulators to keep restaurants open, with holding liquor licenses on healthcare. The healthcare workers had to do it, and if they didn't comply, people were losing their jobs. So people were really under duress at losing their livelihood. Clearly, at the federal level, Joe Biden attempted to be very coercive, and thankfully, people pushed back and won in court in a lot of cases, and we've changed that. But we still haven't changed the underlying laws. And when you look at the product itself, you see a lot of caution in companies that know they're going to get sued if they do something defective. And the idea that we're going to lift that for a vaccine seems crazy to me. There's so much scrutiny on these at this point. And I'm so happy that President Trump helped facilitate the Make America Healthy Again movement to really just ask honest questions like, well, why is this happening? Shouldn't we be looking into that? And instead we're, looking at, whether cats are more likely to chase rats if they've been on a treadmill and had, whatever done to them. I mean, stupid things. And we're really not addressing fundamental challenges with our healthcare system. So we have to end the liability, and we really have to claw back some of the things that were so badly abused during COVID.
Yeah. I think after COVID, a lot of people are wondering about these things. So glad you're taking a look. Now, you originally came on my radar, Congressman, when you were one of only 2 Republicans in the House of Representatives to vote against the One Big Beautiful Bill. You did eventually change your vote when the final version passed through, but I looked at some of your criticism, and you expressed concerns about just the spending, right? I mean, future cuts, things like that. What are your concerns about spending? Senator Tuberville told us last week or a couple weeks ago that y'all were working on a second Big Beautiful Bill. Are you hoping that some more progress can be made on reining in spending in that second one?
Yeah, look, we got way too much government. I was hopeful that we would actually shrink government. And look, we're not getting after the deficit problem with the Big Beautiful Bill. We did get some significant wins, though. And so, look, I voted no in the first bill. I want to be able to vote yes. There are a lot of priorities that the bill funds that I was 100% for in the beginning. But by being no, it put me in the center of negotiations. And look, it could have been no and just stayed there. There's plenty of reasons to oppose it in terms of the total impact on the deficit. I have a lot of respect for Thomas Massie, who's held there, but he wasn't looking to be yes. He's just like, there's nothing you can do to fix this in my view. I'm not voting for it. In my case, I'm like, well, let's get the best bill we can. And so I worked with Rick Scott, Mike Lee, Ron Johnson, and some others in the House. And kudos to Rick Scott for helping facilitate this kind of bicameral dialogue between conservatives in the House and Senate. So initially, we tried to get 2 bills instead of one big, beautiful bill, because once you get one bill, it tends to only get passed by spending more money. And essentially, you just say, well, instead of choosing between what you want and what this other person wants, we'll just give you both, everything you want. And it tends to get, really out of control on spending. So we tried to pass a quick package by March 14th that delivered on conservative priorities like border security, defense, and of course raising the debt limit so that President Trump wouldn't have to deal with it. But the SALT caucus, a group of people fighting for more state and local tax deductions, mostly blue state folks in New York, New Jersey, California, places like that, really forced the idea of having one bill, and they pushed the idea that you would go from $10,000 of state and local tax deduction. They wanted uncapped, but they settled for $40,000. And just while President Trump was president, it's going to cost $350 billion. So as part of the negotiation, we got that cut in half. They still get a claim that they raised it to $40,000, but we did an income test on it so that it caps out, and instead of costing $350, it costs about $180. So not quite exactly half, but we cut it down a lot. And we also increased the scope of the Medicaid cuts. So when the House was coming in, they said, 7.8 million Americans are going to lose their health care. And, we're like, well, let's be clear, illegals aren't Americans. So the people that are losing their health care, illegals who aren't supposed to be on there in the first place, and then able-bodied working age adults that don't have kids at home. So this is the same thing everyone would expect of a friend or family member. If you're able to work, at some point you would get a job. And that initially passed the House, but it didn't kick into like 2029. So the Senate made all those things better. And I think the other big win that we got is killing the AI provision. This is a poorly thought out kind of surveillance expansion, kind of bolt onto the Patriot Act, and we haven't fundamentally dealt with the privacy issue. This should be standalone legislation, not some add-on to a big bill. So at the end of the day, I voted for it. I think it's at least a big, attractive bill. We should certainly do more to get our out-of-control spending reined in, and we have another chance by September 30th to do just that.
So on that subject, a lot of the wins that Trump has secured for his base and for the policy priorities are in executive orders. They're in regulations, proposed regulations. And I know he was a little bit frustrated with the first bill that more of, for example, on the climate change, the environmental stuff, that wasn't in. Do you think you guys are going to be able to get some of those into the next bill that you're talking about in September?
Boy, I don't know. I mean, the mindset, look, we had 0 Republicans vote for the Green New Deal when it was disguised as the Inflation Reduction Act, and Democrats pushed it. But we couldn't really radically overhaul it or just kill it when it was in the House or the Senate. So the final version really doesn't ever fully end the Green New Deal. And the only thing you really have to do to start getting the subsidies is spend 5% of what you say the total project cost is. And you could do it by just buying some solar panels and putting them in a warehouse somewhere. So this is a terrible provision. It should go away. And you'll see, though, the what's the level of will to cut spending. We had a trouble as Republicans agreeing to turn off funding for NPR, National Public Radio, which basically 60 out of 60 on their editorial staff are Democrats. They're always working against what we're trying to do, and they don't need an extra messenger from the left to be able to get the truth out. They're actually, their tagline says they're fact-based journalism. And it's like, well, we're going to select some facts and we're going to spin it as much as we can. What a terrible thing. And we barely defunded that as Republicans. So there's just not the kind of will. Think how bad things had to get in Argentina before Milei had the mandate to actually get spending under control and reform things. That might be, what it takes. We might have to get awful close to the crash site before there's a real will to cut spending.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the Trump Derangement Syndrome Research Act as well. But picking up on what you just said, are you optimistic that we'll be able to get this situation with the spending and the debt and all this under control before a crisis like what you just described comes upon us?
Well, look, one of the most dishonest things about the score, whether it's the CBO score or any of the other models, they assume that in a 10-year model that we'll follow current law. Under current law, if Social Security reaches a point where it's not working right on the withholdings that are specifically marked for Social Security, if Medicare doesn't stay actuarially sound, you're supposed to cut it by 19 to 23%. So the models all assume that Congress really would cut Social Security and Medicare by 19 to 23% starting in 2033, 2034, 2035. Well, we're obviously not going to do that. I mean, we would barely cut NPR, let alone cut Social Security. So that's not going to happen. So it was very dishonest to put it into the score and say, oh, there's no, this goes in the right direction, because it's a huge amount of money. But I don't know that, probably if I were forecasting in the 2032 presidential election, no one will talk about cutting anything. They'll say we're going to go full speed ahead. And then when 2033 comes, they'll go, wow, now what are we going to do? I mean, some poor schmuck's going to run for president in 2032 and then get stuck with this problem, because there just seems like President Trump has learned, like, you don't touch Social Security. Like, I wish it was different. You don't touch Social Security. You don't touch Medicare. Even Medicaid, the only thing he was willing to talk about is fraud, waste, and abuse. And thankfully, he also considers it fraud, waste, and abuse when you have, able-bodied people not contributing, or when you have non-citizens who aren't even supposed to be in our country getting Medicaid. So we were able to get some reforms, but not enough to really bend the curve. Our deficits are like 7% of GDP. For reference, Malay's were only 6% of GDP, and he had a massive mandate to change course.
Yeah. Well, I got to ask you about this one. You've got legislation called the Trump Derangement Syndrome Research Act. It would direct the National Institutes of Health to study the psychological and social roots of what is known as Trump Derangement Syndrome. I'm reading from your press release here. A phenomenon marked by extreme negative reactions to President Trump. And you say here that instead of funding ludicrous studies such as giving methamphetamine to cats or teaching monkeys to gamble for their drinking water, the NIH should use that funding to research issues that are relevant to the real world. And you talk about an epidemic of this TDS on the left. What are the prospects for this passing, and how essential is it for Americans to get an understanding of what's going on here?
Well, I've been frustrated. A lot of my colleagues thought it was just more of a kind of a stunt bill or a messaging bill. But I think it's serious. I mean, if you look at families, I don't know anybody who hasn't dealt with it on a friend relationship basis or family member relationship basis. people don't think rationally about Donald Trump. I mean, they just get this raw emotional response, and there's some phenomenon there. Maybe it applies to other situations too, but it certainly applies to Donald Trump. So it's like, how is it that you have the same statement read and you'll say, yeah, I agree with that, but if you say Donald Trump should do something about that, no, you shouldn't do it. But if you said a different name, we should do something about that, and left it generic, people would agree completely. It's just a completely irrational reaction to Donald Trump. And I think there's a phenomenon there worth studying. It really is kind of creating division and discord in our society. And people blame Donald Trump for that. I don't think it's Donald Trump's fault that everyone reacts to him the way that it is. I think it's worth figuring out exactly how did this come to be and why do people have that kind of a reaction.
It's fantastic. Congressman, we're just about out of time here, but what are your final thoughts for the American people? What should Americans be doing who do want to get a handle on some of these issues that you described, the wild spending, the Federal Reserve doing whatever it feels like it with no accountability, no real oversight, no audits? How can people get involved and make a positive difference for the country?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, look, keep your eye on the future of money, because the current system really has a massive amount of debt. Generally, when countries get this much debt, they do have to restructure something. And that might not happen right now, but probably between now and 2033, there's going to have to be a need to change course pretty radically, because we're wasting time. Every day that goes by, it gets a little bit harder than the last day. I mean, every 100 days or so, we're adding $1 trillion to the debt. And for some people, the solution, they want to change the money, and they want to change it to a central bank digital currency. They want to link it to digital ID and social credit scores. And we have to stop central bank digital currency at all costs. I really believe it is the most coercive tool ever known to man. Think about the coercion under COVID. People were afraid of losing their job. You would literally lose access to your bank account and the entire payment system if you didn't comply with, the central government's authority if you had a central bank digital currency. So we really do need to stop that. And I'd say just reach out to your representative wherever you live. Make sure they hear from you, and if you can get on their calendar, get on their calendar.
Congressman Warren Davidson, Ohio 8th District, represented in the U.S. Congress. Thank you very much for joining us. You serve on the House Financial Services Committee. You were a Army infantryman. You've done a lot of great work. I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for taking on these critical issues, and I hope we can talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks. God bless you and all your listeners and viewers.
Thank you so much. God bless you, too. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. That was Congressman Warren Davidson on some really important legislation dealing with the Federal Reserve. I want to thank you for tuning in, encourage you to get involved. I'm Alex Newman for The New American. This is Conversations That Matter. Until next time, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. God bless you all.
Do you know how your U.S. representative and U.S. senators are voting? Or how about your state legislators? Well, you can find out on thenewamerican.com using the Freedom Index. That's where we keep track of how every member of Congress in the House and the Senate and every legislator of all 50 state legislatures vote on key issues. You can find this out on thenewamerican.com/Freedom Index or on thefreedomindex.org.